It started with a sound no one expected, just a low hum like a microwave running in the next room but coming from every speaker on Earth at once. Phones, radios, car dashboards, even the old kitchen clock that hadn't worked in years, it all lit up at the same second, and then a voice. Calm. Clear. Not human, but not robotic either. It spoke in your language, no matter where you were. In Mumbai, it spoke Hindi. In Oslo, Norwegian. In Nairobi, Swahili. And what it said froze the world in place. Attention, Earth, it began. You have been observed. Your planet is no longer safe for interstellar contact. Due to irreversible damage to your biosphere, unchecked warfare, and reckless technological expansion, the Galactic Concord has voted unanimously. Earth is hereby placed under permanent quarantine. No human vessel may leave lunar orbit. No off-world assistance will be provided. You are exiled from the community of worlds. Then, silence. The hum stopped. Screens went dark. For a full minute, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. In Tokyo, a street vendor dropped his rice balls into the gutter. In Rio, a soccer match paused mid-kick. In a small village in Nepal, a grandmother held her grandson tighter, as if the sky itself might fall. At first, most people thought it was a prank. A deepfake. A government drill gone too far. But within hours, proof came. Not with explosions or invasions, but with absence. Every satellite beyond low Earth orbit stopped responding. GPS flickered, then failed in patches. Weather forecasts went blind. The International Space Station, home to 6 astronauts from 4 countries, sent a final message. We've been told not to return. They're not hostile, just done with us. That's when the real fear set in. Not the kind that makes you scream, but the kind that makes you sit very still and wonder if your whole life, your dreams of Mars colonies, of alien friends, of being part of something bigger, was just a fantasy. Governments held emergency meetings behind closed doors. News channels cycled between panic and denial. Some leaders called it a hoax to distract from economic troubles. Others whispered that it was real, and that humanity had finally crossed a line it couldn't uncross. But here's the strange thing. Instead of collapsing, people started doing something unexpected. They looked around, not up at the stars, but at each other. In Berlin, neighbors who'd never spoken shared generators when the power grid wobbled. In Jakarta, fishermen pooled their boats to check if the ocean signals were really gone. In Detroit, a retired engineer rigged an old ham radio to listen for any sign of the Concord. Not to beg, but to understand, because the message hadn't come with threats. No lasers, no invasions, no demands for surrender, just a quiet, devastating judgment. You're not ready. You're not welcome. And that hurt more than any war. Scientists scrambled. They checked every telescope, every deep space antenna. Nothing. The stars looked the same, but now they felt like closed doors. The Milky Way, once a promise, now felt like a wall. Yet in labs and garages and university basements, a new kind of urgency sparked. If Earth was on its own, then Earth had to save itself. Not in 100 years. Now, old space programs, long underfunded and half forgotten, were dusted off. Not for glory anymore, but for survival. If humanity couldn't join the galaxy, maybe it could at least escape its own shadow before it was too late. Rumors spread of secret meetings between rival nations. China and the US, India and Russia, countries that barely trusted each other with trade deals, were suddenly sharing launch schedules and fuel formulas. Not out of friendship, but necessity. Because if the Concord had drawn a line at the moon, then everything beyond it was still human territory. For now, and time was running out. People began noticing small changes. Military satellites were repurposed to monitor deforestation instead of borders. AI systems once used for advertising were redirected to model climate repair. Even social media shifted. Less arguing, more sharing. How to build a water purifier from scrap. Seed banks near you. Community solar grids, step by step. It wasn't perfect. There were riots in some cities, hoarding in others. Fear always brings out the worst in some. But for the first time in generations, the worst wasn't winning. In schools, kids stopped asking, "Will we meet aliens?" and started asking, "Can we fix Earth before they come back?" Because deep down, everyone hoped this wasn't forever, that the exile was a test, a warning, a chance, and maybe, just maybe, if humanity proved it could grow up, the galaxy might open its doors again. But that would take more than hope. It would take action. And the clock was ticking. While world leaders debated, ordinary people began building. Not spaceships, not yet, but something just as vital. Trust. Cooperation. A shared belief that even if the stars had turned their backs, Earth was still worth fighting for. And in the quiet nights, when the city lights dimmed and the sky was clear, people didn't look up with wonder anymore. They looked up with purpose, because the message from the stars hadn't ended with goodbye. It had ended with a challenge, and humanity, stubborn as ever, wasn't about to fail it without a fight. After the message from the stars, the world didn't fall apart. It got to work. Not with speeches or grand promises, but with hands. With tools. With quiet, stubborn determination. Because if Earth was locked out of the galaxy, then humanity had one last shot. Get off the planet before the door slammed shut for good. It started in places most people never noticed. Old rocket factories rusting in the desert, abandoned launch pads swallowed by weeds, dusty warehouses full of forgotten blueprints. Engineers who'd spent years designing luxury space hotels or Mars vacations now huddled over coffee-stained schematics, redrawing them for one brutal purpose: escape. Governments, usually slow and tangled in red tape, moved faster than anyone thought possible. Rival nations that had spent decades spying on each other began sharing launch codes and fuel formulas, not because they suddenly liked one another, but because there was no time for pride. If the conquered had drawn a line at the moon, then everything beyond it was still human space. For now, they called it Project Arclight, not because it was hopeful, but because it was honest. These weren't shiny starships from old movies. They were patched-together cylinders built from retired cargo rockets, reinforced with scrap metal and layers of radiation shielding, made from lunar regolith simulant. Inside, no seats, no windows, just rows of cryopods stacked like shipping containers, each one holding a person in deep sleep for the long journey ahead. The goal wasn't to find a new Earth, it was to disappear. To drift into the dark between stars where the conquered wouldn't bother looking, hide long enough for humanity to prove it could change, or at least survive long enough to try. But here's the hard truth. Not everyone could go. That's when the real pain began. A global lottery was set up, not based on wealth or power, but on a cold mix of science and chance. Genetic diversity mattered, so did skills. Doctors, engineers, botanists, teachers. Age mattered too. Young bodies healed better, adapted faster. Families stood in line for hours just to register, holding children's hands like they might vanish any second. In some places, people accepted it quietly. In others, anger boiled over. Protests flared in cities where people felt left behind, not just by the stars, but by their own kind. Why should only the lucky few get a second chance? Became a common cry. Yet even in those crowds, you'd see someone handing out water, someone sharing a blanket, someone whispering, "If they make it, maybe they'll come back for us." And that was the strange thing. Amid the fear, a new kind of unity started to grow. Not the loud flag-waving kind, but the quiet kind that shows up when your neighbor offers you a seat on their solar charger or teaches your kid how to purify rainwater. While the arcs were being built in orbit, life on the ground changed too. With satellites gone, the internet shrank. People stopped scrolling and started talking face to face. Local markets boomed. Barter returned. Skills once called old-fashioned, like fixing engines, growing food, stitching wounds, became more valuable than any digital currency. Schools shifted focus. Kids didn't just learn math and history. They learned how to build water filters, how to read weather patterns without apps, how to grow food in concrete cracks. Teachers said it was the most engaged they'd ever seen students, because for the first time, what they learned might actually save a life, maybe their own. Back at the launch sites, work never stopped. Shifts ran 24 hours a day. Workers slept in tents near the pads, ate meals from shared pots, and passed around photos of their families like good luck charms. No one got paid much. Most did it for rations, for safety, for the slim hope that their child's name might be drawn in the next lottery round. The first test launch happened at dawn. A modified heavy-lift rocket, painted not with national flags but with a simple symbol, a circle with a single arrow pointing outward. It carried no crew, just supplies, seeds, and a time capsule filled with voices. A grandmother singing a lullaby, a street musician playing guitar, a child describing what clouds looked like. A message not to aliens but to whoever might find it centuries later. We were here. We tried. It reached orbit. Docked with the first ARC module. Cheers erupted, but they were short-lived. Because everyone knew this was just the beginning. The real test would come when people had to say goodbye. That day came sooner than expected. When the first cryopod list was posted, projected onto public walls in major cities, thousands gathered, not to riot, but to watch. Some cried. Some hugged strangers. Others just stood in silence, reading names they didn't know but felt like family. The chosen didn't celebrate. They packed light, just a change of clothes, a photo, maybe a small keepsake. No one brought luxury. There was no room for it. And when they boarded the shuttles that would take them to the orbiting arcs, they didn't look back with joy but with sorrow. Because leaving Earth wasn't freedom, it was exile by another name. Yet they went. Not because they wanted to, but because someone had to carry the torch. Down below, those left behind didn't give up. If anything, they worked harder. Every repaired wind turbine, every reforested hillside, every clean river became a silent message to the stars. We're still here. And we're changing. And in the quiet hours when the launch flames faded from the sky, people would look up, not with envy, but with pride. Because those arcs weren't just escaping, they were hoping. And hope, even in the darkest void, is never wasted. No one knew if the Concorde was watching. But humanity acted like they were. Every act of kindness, every repaired ecosystem, every shared meal became part of a larger answer to the galaxy's judgment. The arcs kept launching, 3, then 5, then 8, each one carrying a piece of Earth into the unknown. And with every departure, those left behind made a silent promise. We'll be better. So when you return, or when they look again, they'll see we deserved a second chance. It wasn't about winning back the stars. It was about earning the right to look up without shame, and in that shared purpose, Earth, broken, bruised, but not beaten, began to heal, one small act at a time. Not everyone believed running away was the answer. While rockets lit up the night sky carrying sleepers into the void, others stayed behind. Not out of resignation, but rebellion. A quiet kind of rebellion, one that didn't shout but planted. That didn't flee but fixed. It began in small places. A group of students in a coastal town started dragging plastic out of the sea. Not for credit, not for fame, but because the fish were dying and the water smelled wrong. They built floating barriers from old nets and bamboo, then taught others how to do the same. Soon, similar crews popped up along coastlines from Chile to Vietnam. No orders, no funding. Just people who refused to let their home rot while waiting for rescue. Then came the forests. In places where wildfires had turned hills to ash, volunteers showed up with shovels and seed balls, clay-packed mixes of native plants that could survive dry soil. They didn't wait for governments. They used drones made from toy parts to map burn zones, then walked the land themselves, dropping seeds by hand. In one region, a whole valley that had been silent for years began to chirp again. Birds returning, insects buzzing, life pushing through cracked earth. This wasn't just cleanup. It was a statement. If the galaxy saw Earth as a wound, then humanity would become the bandage. A loose network formed. Farmers, scientists, teachers, retired mechanics, all connected by encrypted radio and handwritten notes passed hand to hand. They called themselves Terra Firma, not as a name but as a reminder. We stand on solid ground. We stay. Their biggest idea was wild, almost foolish. Reverse the damage fast enough that the conquered might notice. Not with weapons or signals, but with proof. Clean air, clean water, quiet skies. They knew the aliens, if that's what they were, had been watching for a long time. So they made Earth worth watching again. In cities, rooftops bloomed with gardens. Old parking lots became food forests. People tore up concrete to plant fruit trees that would feed neighborhoods for decades. Solar panels went up on every usable surface, wired together in microgrids so entire blocks could power themselves without waiting for broken national systems. And the oceans, the oceans changed most of all. Fishermen who once chased the last tuna now guarded coral nurseries they'd built from ceramic tiles and old pipes. Drones, powered by wave energy, drifted through dead zones releasing clouds of oxygen-rich bubbles. In one bay, after 2 years of work, The water cleared enough that kids could see their feet again when they waded in. That moment, simple, ordinary, felt like a miracle. Governments, at first suspicious, slowly joined in. Not because they believed in the mission, but because people demanded it. Laws changed. Factories that once dumped waste were converted to recycling hubs. Military budgets shrank. Ecological repair budgets grew. It wasn't perfect. Old habits die hard, but the direction was clear. Earth was no longer a resource to drain, but a home to heal. Then something strange happened. A satellite, long thought dead, blinked back to life for just 3 seconds. It sent one image, a patch of the Amazon, greener than it had been in 50 years. No message, just data, but those who understood knew. Someone was still watching. Hope, fragile as a sprout after fire, began to rise. People started leaving gifts for the sky. Not signals or pleas, but actions. In Siberia, a whole village spent winter planting cold-resistant pines across thawing permafrost. In the Sahara, engineers dug ancient-style wells that pulled moisture from the air, turning dust into patches of green. Each project was logged, photographed, and broadcast on low-frequency radio, not aimed at stars but open to anyone listening. Schools taught children to measure air quality with homemade kits. Grandparents taught grandchildren which plants cleaned which toxins from soil. Knowledge flowed not through apps but through stories told under trees or around shared stoves. And slowly the numbers shifted. Carbon levels in the air began to dip, not by a little but by enough that climate models had to be rewritten. Rivers that hadn't seen fish in a generation began to ripple with silver flashes. Bees returned to cities where flowers once struggled to grow. It wasn't magic. It was sweat. It was stubbornness. It was millions of people choosing every day to care more than they feared. Even those who'd lost loved ones to the Arcs found purpose here. A mother whose child was on the Peregrine started a seed library, sending packets of heirloom vegetables to every community she could reach. If they come back, she'd say, I want them to taste home. Others built libraries of human knowledge, not digital but carved into stone or printed on acid-free paper, stored in mountain vaults. Not for aliens, for the future humans who might one day read them and say, they didn't give up. And then the first real sign came, off the coast of New Zealand. A fishing boat spotted something floating, not debris, but a smooth silver sphere no bigger than a basketball. It hummed softly, scanned the kelp forest below, then rose into the clouds and vanished. No warning, no threat, just observation. That night, bonfires lit up coastlines around the world, not in fear but in quiet celebration. They'd been seen. And this time, Earth wasn't burning. It was blooming. The terra firma movement didn't declare victory. They knew one scan meant nothing, but it meant everything, because it proved they weren't shouting into the void. Someone was listening. From then on, the work deepened, not faster but wiser. Communities began sharing not just tools but values. Take only what you need. Leave the land better than you found it. Help your neighbor before you help yourself. These weren't slogans. They were daily practice. In places once ruled by greed or fear, cooperation became the new currency. A farmer in Kenya traded drought-resistant seeds with a beekeeper in Greece. A group in Canada sent hand-crank radios to villages rebuilding after floods. No money changed hands, just trust. And through it all, Earth changed. Not overnight, but steadily, like a river carving stone. The air smelled cleaner. Nights grew darker as light pollution faded. Stars, once drowned out by city glare, returned to view. People started pointing them out to their children again, not as distant gods, but as witnesses. We're showing them, someone said during a village meeting in the Andes, that we can be more than our mistakes. That became the quiet anthem of the age. Not we're sorry, but we're trying. Not let us back in, but watch what we can become. And as forests thickened, rivers cleared, and cities learned to breathe again, humanity began to believe something it hadn't in centuries. Maybe they didn't need the stars to validate them. Maybe healing Earth was enough. But deep down, everyone hoped, just a little, that the galaxy was taking notes. 3 years after the first ark left Earth, silence was all anyone expected from deep space. The ships were supposed to vanish into the dark, hidden among comets and ice fields, waiting out humanity's cosmic timeout. No one thought they'd come back, especially not so soon. But then a signal crackled through the old emergency bands. Faint at first, then clear. Not a distress call, not a warning, Just a voice, tired but steady, speaking in plain words everyone could understand. This is the Peregrine. We're turning around. Tell Earth. They're watching, and they're giving us a chance. No one believed it at first. Too many hoaxes had spread since the Exile began, but within hours telescopes confirmed it. The lead arc, carrying thousands in cryosleep, had shifted course. It wasn't heading for the outer rim. It was coming home. Panic flared in some places. They'll bring back disease, some whispered. Or worse, false hope. Others feared the Concorde had sent the arc back as a trap, a way to monitor Earth more closely. But most people just stood still, hearts pounding, wondering what this meant. When the Peregrine finally entered lunar orbit, it didn't ask for clearance from any one nation. Instead, its captain broadcast a simple request. Let us land where Earth is healing the fastest. After days of tense talks, the answer came. Nairobi. Not because it was rich or powerful, but because it had become a symbol. Rooftop farms covered old office blocks. Rivers once choked with waste now ran clear through community-led cleanups. Solar microgrids powered clinics and schools without a single drop of imported fuel. It wasn't perfect, but it was trying harder than most. The landing wasn't like the old days of spaceflight. No grandstands, no flags, no speeches from presidents. Just a dusty field on the edge of the city, surrounded by people holding handmade signs that read "Welcome Home" in a dozen languages. Children sat on shoulders, eyes wide, not sure if they were watching history or a dream. The ramp lowered slowly. Out stepped not soldiers or scientists in fancy suits, but ordinary people in worn flight suits, blinking in the sunlight like they'd forgotten what real warmth felt like. Some cried, some dropped to their knees and touched the soil. One simply stood still, breathing deeply, as if making sure the air was real. What they brought back wasn't technology or alien gifts. It was a message and a choice. During their journey, the Ark had been intercepted, not by weapons, but by a single, silent vessel near Jupiter's orbit. No threats were made. Instead, the Concorde shared data. Earth's carbon levels were dropping. Forests were returning. Ocean acidity was stabilizing. For the first time in centuries, the planet's vital signs were improving. Then came the offer. Rejoin the galactic community. But only if humanity proved this change wasn't temporary. No more half measures. No more promises broken. Full transparency. Shared knowledge. And above all, peace, not just between nations but with the planet itself. The captain of the Peregrine could have stayed silent. Could have hidden the truth and let the Ark vanish again. But she chose to return. Not to lead, but to ask, are we ready to accept this? Her words spread faster than any signal ever had. Not through satellites, those were still quiet, but through word-of-mouth shortwave radios and handwritten letters passed from town to town. People gathered in squares, in fields, in schoolyards, debating not if the offer was real, but if humanity deserved it. Some said no. They exiled us once, they argued. Why trust them now? Others feared losing freedom. What if the Concorde demanded control in exchange for help? But many more saw it differently. This wasn't about trusting aliens. It was about trusting each other, because the real test wasn't out there in space. It was here on the ground. Could humanity keep healing even if no one was watching? Could it choose cooperation over conflict, care over greed, long-term survival over short-term gain? The return of the Peregrine didn't solve anything, but it lit a fire. Communities that had been working in isolation now reached out to each other. A village in Bangladesh shared its rainwater harvesting design with a drought-stricken town in Arizona. A group of engineers in Brazil sent open-source plans for wind turbines to nomadic herders in Mongolia. The idea wasn't to impress the stars. It was to prove to themselves that they could build something better together, and something shifted in the air. Not just cleaner, but lighter. Hope, once a fragile thing, began to take root. When the Ark's crew finally stepped into the city, they weren't treated like heroes. They were treated like family. Strangers offered them meals. Kids asked to see their space boots. Elders shared stories of the old Earth, the one before the warning, and the new one being built now. One moment captured it all. A young girl, no older than 10, handed a sprout in a clay pot to a crew member. "This is from our school garden," she said. "It's a mango tree. Will you take it back with you, just in case?" The crew member knelt, took the pot gently and whispered, "We won't need to run again, not if you keep growing things like this." That night, under a sky full of stars that no longer felt like judges, people talked late into the night. Not about escape, but about staying. About building. About becoming the kind of species that didn't need to be told to do better. Because it just did. The peregrine remained grounded. Not as a monument, but as a reminder. Exile wasn't the end. It was a mirror, and for the first time, humanity liked what it saw staring back. Now the real work began. Not to impress the galaxy, but to honor the chance they'd been given. Because coming home wasn't just about landing on Earth again. It was about finally learning how to live here. The final decision didn't come from governments or generals. It didn't come from scientists in labs or leaders in tall buildings. It came from everyone. Every person over the age of 12, from the child in a mountain village to the elder in a coastal town, got one vote and one voice. The conquered hadn't asked for a signature or a treaty. They'd asked for proof that humanity had changed, not just in actions but in heart. So Earth responded the only way it could, by letting its people speak for themselves. Voting stations popped up everywhere, under trees, in schoolyards, inside repurposed buses, even on fishing boats. No fancy machines, just simple tablets powered by hand cranks or solar chargers, linked to a secure, open network built from old phone lines and community radio towers. Each vote was tied to a biometric scan, just enough to prevent cheating but not enough to track or control. Privacy was sacred now. Trust had to be earned, not forced. The question was plain. Do you accept the terms of the Galactic Concord, permanent care for Earth, shared knowledge and peace among all people, in exchange for rejoining the community of worlds? For weeks, lines formed at dawn. People walked miles through rain and dust just to cast their vote. Some brought their grandparents in wheelbarrows. Others carried babies on their backs, whispering, "This is for you." There were no campaigns, no ads, no shouting. Just quiet conversations over shared meals. What kind of world do we want to leave behind? When the count began, the whole planet held its breath. Not because they feared the answer, but because they finally believed their choice mattered. The result came on a clear morning, broadcast not through satellites but through a chain of ground-based relays, carried from town to town like a message in a bottle. 73% said yes. Not a landslide, not total agreement, but enough. Enough to show that the majority had chosen care over fear, unity over division, Earth over escape. But the real victory wasn't the number. It was what happened next. Within hours, military bases began shutting down. Not by order, but by choice. Soldiers handed over keys to community councils. Tanks were stripped for scrap metal to build water pumps. Fighter jets were grounded, their parts repurposed for wind turbines and medical drones. No one celebrated with fireworks. They celebrated by planting trees where runways once roared. Corporations that once guarded secrets like treasure opened their patents to the public. Designs for clean energy, water purifiers, soil regenerators. Free for anyone to use, improve, and share. Profit didn't disappear, but it stopped being the only goal. A new measure took hold. Does this help more people than it harms? Schools rewrote their lessons. History wasn't just about wars and kings anymore. It was about cooperation, repair, and the quiet heroes who rebuilt after disaster. Children learned to code not just apps, but ecosystems. How to balance a pond, how to read soil health, how to listen to the land and the stars. They didn't suddenly light up with alien ships. No grand welcome party came from the sky. The conquered stayed distant, watching. But this time their silence felt different, not cold but patient, because they knew the hardest part wasn't saying yes. It was living it, every day after the vote became a test. Would cities keep sharing power during blackouts? Would farmers keep saving seeds for neighbors? Would nations keep trading knowledge instead of weapons? The answer came slowly in small moments. A village in the desert sharing its last water filter with newcomers. A city turning its old prison into a seed bank. A group of teens building a library from salvaged wood and donated books. There were stumbles, of course. Old habits don't vanish overnight. Arguments flared. Mistakes were made. But now when someone acted selfishly, others didn't just complain, they stepped in. "We voted for better," they'd say gently. "Let's try again." And Earth began to breathe easier. Not because the problems were gone, but because no one faced them alone anymore. Years later, when the first official Concorde probe finally landed, not in a capital, but in a rewilded valley once scarred by mining, its only message was a single sentence, projected onto a screen made of woven grass. You were never exiled from the stars. You were invited to grow up. People didn't cheer. They nodded, because they understood now. The exile wasn't punishment. It was a mirror. And for the first time in its history, humanity had looked into it and decided to change. The arcs still floated in the outer dark, but they no longer carried refugees. They became libraries, observatories, peaceful outposts, symbols not of escape but of responsibility. Some even returned, not to flee but to share what they'd learned in the silence of space. Back on Earth, life wasn't perfect. Storms still came, droughts still burned, but communities were ready. They had each other. They had clean water. They had seeds. And most of all, they had a promise, not to the stars but to themselves. Children grew up never knowing a world where people fought over borders while the planet burned. To them, sharing was normal. Repairing was routine. Looking up at the night sky wasn't about dreaming of leaving. It was about remembering how close they'd come to losing everything, and how they chose together to stay and heal. And in the end, that was enough. Not because the galaxy said so, but because humanity finally believed it too.